In the spring of 2003, a debut album arrived in music stores across Canada and began, quietly and then rapidly, to change the landscape of popular music. The voice on that album was warm and unhurried, carrying the weight of decades of American songbook tradition through a 27-year-old from Burnaby, British Columbia, who had spent the better part of a decade being told that the music he loved was finished. The album sold 2 million copies in its first year. It reached the top of international charts in multiple countries. It launched a career that would fill arenas on every continent, produce Grammy Awards, and generate some of the most beloved recordings of its era. The man who had given Michael Bublé that voice, who had placed the first Sinatra record on a turntable in front of a 9-year-old boy and watched something ignite that nothing in the years that followed could extinguish, never heard a single note of it. Demetrio Santaga, Michael's maternal grandfather, died in the months before the album was released. He died without knowing that the world was about to discover what he had understood decades earlier in a modest living room in Burnaby. He died before the applause began. This is not a story about tragedy. Michael Bublé's life and career were not tragedies. But there is a specific quiet weight that sits beneath every great success when the person who first believed in you is no longer present to witness it. The weight does not diminish with distance or with time. It travels. It sits in the wings of every sold-out arena. It exists in the silence before the first note. And this is the story of what Michael did with that weight, not in an interview, not in a press release, but backstage alone before every single concert, in a private ritual that nobody had asked him to perform and that he never once considered stopping. Demetrio Santaga came to Canada as an Italian immigrant carrying the things that immigrants carry, the language and customs of a country embedded in the bones, a cultural vocabulary that does not fully translate into the new world but never fully disappears either. What he also carried with the fervor of genuine love rather than nostalgic obligation was a passion for the great American standards. Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole, Dean Martin, Bobby Darin, Bing Crosby. These singers represented for Demetrio not simply music but a way of being in the world, romantic, warm, alive to beauty and melancholy in equal measure, capable of holding both without choosing between them. He filled his home in Burnaby with this music, not as background, not as atmosphere, but as presence, the way some homes are filled with the smell of cooking or the constant sound of a spoken language, as the medium through which daily life is conducted rather than an addition to it. When Michael was brought into that home as a child, the music was simply there. It was the air of the place. Michael was 9 years old when he first stopped and truly listened. Not the passive listening of a child in a room where music happens to be playing, but the active, absorbed listening of someone who has heard something that speaks to them in a language they did not know they already knew. He stood in Demetrio's living room and listened to a Sinatra record with a stillness that 9-year-olds rarely achieve, the kind that tells the adults around them something is happening that is larger than the moment and deserves to be left alone. Demetrio watched him. He had listened to great singers for decades and understood the difference between a child who enjoyed music and a child who had been claimed by it. He said nothing that day. He let the record play to its end. But from that afternoon forward, his relationship with Michael organized itself entirely around the music. He played him recordings across different eras and styles. He explained what made one singer's phrasing different from another's, why Sinatra's breath control created a specific emotional intimacy, why Nat King Cole's timing made simple lyrics feel inevitable. He taught Michael to listen not just to the melody, but to the space around it, to the breath, to the pause, to what a great vocalist could hold in a single sustained note. It was an education conducted entirely through love. Without curriculum or formal acknowledgement, across years of afternoons that Michael would later describe as the most important of his musical life, Michael sang along, then he sang alone. Then he began performing at family events, at school functions, in the small venues that would accept a teenager with a voice that seemed to belong to another era entirely. Demetrio attended everything he could and afterward said something specific. Not general praise, he was not a man for general praise. He would identify a particular phrase in the performance, a specific moment, and say precisely what had worked or what had almost worked. Those conversations, Michael would say in interviews decades later, were the most useful musical education he received, more useful than any formal instruction. more useful than any producer's note or industry feedback. Because they came from someone who was evaluating not his marketability but his truth. But the growing took longer than either of them had anticipated. The world was not yet ready to receive what Demetrio had recognized in that living room, and Demetrio, who was not a young man, would not have infinite time to wait for it. Through his late teens and 20s, Michael performed wherever he could find an audience, bars where the bartenders were louder than the music, cruise ship lounges with captive audiences who had not specifically come to listen, corporate events where he was hired as atmosphere and treated as furniture, hotel ballrooms where 200 people spent the evening talking to each other while a young man in a good suit sang standards into a microphone that nobody had properly tuned. The music industry rejected him with the polite consistency of institutions that cannot categorize what they are hearing. The classic standards were finished as a commercial proposition, he was told again and again, by people with access to market research and demographic data and the accumulated wisdom of an industry that understood its own patterns better than it understood its own exceptions. A young Canadian singing songs from the golden age of popular music was not something the market was asking for. He was talented, genuinely, undeniably talented, but the timing was wrong, and timing in the music business was not a small thing. Demetrio did not accept this analysis. He was not an industry professional and had no particular interest in their data. What he knew was what he had always known, that his grandson's voice was exceptional, that the music it carried was real, and that real things found their audience. If the person carrying them refused to stop, he said this to Michael with the calm certainty of someone whose conviction rested not on optimism, but on evidence accumulated over 60 years of serious listening. He had heard great singers. He knew what greatness sounded like. He was not confused about what he was hearing when Michael sang. Michael kept going. Demetrio kept coming to the shows when he could, sitting in whatever seat was available, listening with the complete attention he had always brought to music, not as a fan performing enthusiasm, but as someone for whom listening was a serious act, a form of respect. As Demetrio aged and travel became harder and health concerns accumulated, he came less frequently. There were conversations that neither of them had with the directness those conversations deserved, because neither was ready to have them. The shows continued, the rejections continued, and the world had still not arrived at the conclusion that Demetrio had reached in a living room in Burnaby decades earlier. And then in the early months of 2003, with the debut album recorded and in production and the world on the very edge of finally hearing what Demetrio had understood for years, Demetrio Santaga became seriously ill. The illness moved faster than anyone was prepared for. The album had been recorded. David Foster had produced it with the level of craft and investment that the voice deserved and the songs required, arrangements that honored the originals while creating space for Michael's own interpretive voice, a sound that was simultaneously deeply rooted in tradition and unmistakably contemporary. Bruce Allen had secured the distribution. The machinery of a real record release was in motion for the first time in Michael's career, moving with a momentum that he had spent nearly a decade trying to generate and had finally managed to set going. Before the release, Michael sat with Demetrio in the house in Burnaby and played him recordings from the sessions. The same house, the same room where the Sinatra records had played on the same turntable that had started everything. He watched his grandfather listen with eyes closed in the way he had always listened to music he was taking seriously, completely still, the quality of attention that blocked out everything except the sound. When the playback ended, Demetrio was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "This is it," not as a question, as a recognition, as the statement of someone who had been waiting for a specific thing to arrive and was now, finally, acknowledging its arrival. He did not live to hear the album released to the world. He did not see the charts or the reviews or the sold-out shows that followed. He did not sit in an arena and watch 20,000 people receive what he had understood in that living room, what he had been certain of through all the years of small clubs and corporate events and industry rejections. He died in early 2003, before the world had the chance to confirm what he already knew. Michael was with him at the end. He would not discuss the specifics in any public forum. They belonged to the family and to the privacy that grief requires and deserves. What he would say in the years that followed, in various interviews and in the rare moments when he spoke about his grandfather directly, was that losing Demetrio was the most significant loss of his professional life and one of the deepest of his personal. One, that the two categories were, in this particular case, impossible to separate, that the man and the music had arrived together in his life, and their separation felt like the same loss expressed in two different registers simultaneously. The album came out weeks after the funeral. It entered the charts. It climbed. Michael began doing something before every performance that nobody had told him to do, and that he never fully explained to anyone, something that started the night after Demetrio died and never stopped. Before every concert, not recording sessions, not television appearances, not radio interviews, but every live performance in front of a live audience, Michael Bublé would find somewhere private. A dressing room corner, a quiet stretch of backstage corridor, any space that was away from the crew and the production noise and the organized urgency of a show in its final preparations. He would sit down, he would be still, and he would talk to his grandfather, not metaphorically, not as a therapeutic exercise in grief processing. He would speak quietly and directly to Demetrio, reporting on where he was that night, what the venue was like, how many people were coming. He would describe the city if it was somewhere he thought Demetrio might have found interesting. He would say, "I think you would have liked this one." Or, "The hall has extraordinary acoustics, you would have appreciated that." Or sometimes simply, "I'm here. I wanted you to know." He told almost nobody. His wife Luisana eventually understood, with the quiet knowledge that comes from sharing a life with someone rather than being explicitly told, from watching closely enough to see the shape of things that are not directly explained. A few senior members of his touring crew had noticed the pattern over the years, the brief disappearance before every show, the particular quality of stillness that he carried back from those private minutes, and had respected it the way experienced touring crews respect anything that is clearly part of a performer's essential preparation, without requiring explanation or offering commentary. The ritual was not performed grief. It was not a public tribute or a dedication announced from the stage, though Michael occasionally dedicated shows to his grandfather in those terms as well. What happened in those private minutes was different from a dedication. It happened before the show existed, before the audience had taken their seats, in the space between the ordinary life of a touring musician and the extraordinary thing he was about to walk out and do. It was, in the most literal available sense, the act that made the performance possible, the source that he returned to every night before drawing from it. Every song in Michael's repertoire that had existed in Demetrio's collection carried a double weight into every performance. The song itself, the melody, the lyric, the specific emotional territory it had been mapping since the first time someone sang it. And beneath that, inseparable from it, the memory of hearing that song for the first time in a living room in Burnaby, of watching Demetrio's face as it played, of understanding something about what music was for before having words for the understanding. That double weight was not a burden in the way that burdens slow you down. It was the source. It was what gave the performances the quality that audiences felt without being able to name, the sense that the voice was connected to something deeper than technique, that the emotion in the phrasing came from somewhere real and specific rather than somewhere general and performed. But it was also genuinely a weight, because every standing ovation, every sold-out night, every review that praised his warmth and his authenticity and the timeless quality of his connection with the material was simultaneously a reminder that Demetrio had not been there to receive it. That the man who had started all of this, who had put the first record on the turntable, who had said this is it with the certainty of someone who had been waiting for decades to say it, had been denied the specific satisfaction of watching the world arrive at the conclusion he had reached in a living room. That success, when it finally came, had arrived one season too late. For the person who had most deserved to see it, Michael carried this without complaint and without public display. He let it do what grief does when it is not resisted, deepen the connection to what matters, clarify the stakes, make the music mean more than it would have meant without the loss behind it. When he sang the songs that Demetrio had loved to 20,000 people who had come to receive them, one of those people in the most private and non-transferable sense of the word was always Demetrio Santaga. The ritual held open a space in every performance for the person whose belief had made the performance possible. The audiences received the result without knowing its source. They felt the depth and called it warmth. They felt the connection and called it charisma. What it actually was, in its deepest dimension, was love directed at someone not in the room, translated through music into something that everyone present could receive without knowing what they were receiving. When Michael married Luisana Lapalato in 2011, she brought to the relationship the particular attentiveness of someone who had navigated her own public life without losing the private person underneath. She noticed the quality of his silence before shows, the way he became briefly unreachable in the hour leading up to a performance, not distantly or coldly but inwardly, as though some part of him had gone somewhere that the ordinary social world did not have access to. She noticed how he returned from those private moments, not transformed dramatically, but settled, centered, as though something that had been searching had found what it was looking for. She did not ask him to explain it, and she did not join him in it. She understood with the instinct of someone who had loved a performer long enough to understand what performances cost and what they required, that what happened in those minutes before the show was not hers to enter. It was his. It was between him and Demetrio. She respected this with the respect that genuine love brings to the parts of another person it cannot fully reach, not with resignation, but with the active acknowledgement that some things are sacred precisely because they belong entirely to someone else. On the difficult nights, the performances where the voice had been less than he wanted, or the connection with the audience had felt forced, or the gap between what he was doing and what he wished he were doing had been more visible to him than usual, she would say something precise. Not comforting in the vague sense, but accurate in the specific one. She would say, he would have seen what you were trying to do. He always did. It was each time exactly the right thing to say, because it was true. Demetrio had always evaluated Michael's performances by what he was reaching for rather than only by what he achieved. Luisana had understood this without being told and offered it at the moments when Michael most needed to hear it. Tens of millions of people have heard Michael Bublé sing. They have carried his recordings into their own lives, into kitchens and cars, and the specific private moments that music finds without being invited. They have built around his voice their own collections of memory and association. His albums have been playing at weddings and anniversaries and ordinary Tuesday evenings when someone needed something warm in the background. His concerts have given people 2 hours of collective joy that they describe afterward in terms that belong more to experience than entertainment. None of them knew, while any of this was happening, that the music they were building their memories on had itself been built on a memory, on a living room in Burnaby, on a turntable that played the same records for decades. On an Italian immigrant who understood something about beauty and passed it, through years of shared listening and specific conversation, to a 9-year-old boy who had the voice to carry it further than either of them could have imagined. They did not need to know. The music carried it for them, the way music always carries what words cannot, the way a voice can hold what a person cannot fully say and deliver it across distances that would otherwise be uncrossable. Before every show, in whatever city the tour has arrived at, Michael Bublé finds a quiet space. He sits down. The arena noise continues outside, the sound checks, the crew moving equipment, the low building hum of an audience taking their seats. He lets it recede, and he speaks quietly to a man who has been gone for more than 2 decades and who never heard the applause that his belief made possible. He says, "I'm here." He says, "Tonight there are 20,000 people." He says whatever needs to be said on that particular night in that particular city, the private accounting that has preceded every public performance since the spring of 2003. Then he stands up, he puts on his jacket, he walks toward the stage. What follows, the 2 hours that the audience receives, the warmth and the voice and the connection that 20,000 people carry home with them into their own lives, is not separate from that quiet moment. It is its continuation. It is the public form of a private conversation that has been ongoing for more than 2 decades. The outward expression of something that began in a living room in Burnaby when a grandfather put a record on a turntable, and a boy stopped what he was doing to listen and understood, in the way that children sometimes understand things before they have language for them, that this was the most important sound he had ever heard. Demetrio Santaga never heard the applause, but he heard something better, and earlier, the moment a 9-year-old boy stood completely still in his living room and understood without words what music was for. He heard the beginning of the story. Michael has spent the rest of his career singing the rest of it, to audiences who will never know the first chapter, and to a grandfather who never hear the last. The turntable still turns, the song is still playing, and somewhere in the warmth of every Michael Bublé performance, in the quality of connection that audiences feel without being able to name it, Demetrio Santaga is still in the room, not as a ghost, as a gift, as the thing that was given once, in love, without condition, and that has been returning ever since in every note his grandson has ever sung.